Welcome, everyone, to This Beautiful Life, the podcast. This is the podcast where I interview just regular, everyday people, and I find out who they are and how they see the world and how their life has informed their worldview. This podcast is an attempt to counterbalance a social media narrative that just separates us into echo chambers, where we only listen to the people who think the same as us, and the people who don't think the same as us become the enemy. This podcast is an exercise in empathy. It is an exploration of the human condition. The mission here is to learn about other people's lives without judging, without shaming, just an opportunity to learn about other people's perspectives. In today's podcast, I would like to introduce you to my friend Amir. 15 years ago, I did a master's degree in Israel, and Amir was in my class. He was born in America, but made Aliyah. Aliyah is the term for a Jew becoming Israeli. And he has lived there ever since with his wife and his little girl. I would like to remind you, if you're going to comment on this podcast, that Amir and I are both real people. Please don't say anything on the computer that you wouldn't say if we were right in front of your face. Without further ado, enjoy. Amir, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you, Erin.
Nice to see you.
My name is Amir Katz, and I have a bit of a binary duality to my name because Amir means prince and Katz is a priest. And so I have a little bit of the principality and the state. I'm from Boston originally. My old man was Israeli of blessed memory. My mother's American born. And I'm an identical twin. I'm a middle child with an older brother. I left home at 14 and have not stopped wandering for the last 25 years.
That's awesome. Now, you've been in Israel for 15 years?
About 15, 16 years, yeah. I waited till I was 25 to move to Israel because at that time that meant I was exempt from army service. I grew up in a very left-wing, communist, anti-militaristic household. And because my father had been an Israeli soldier, and my grandfather had been a soldier in each with their respective wars, I very much wanted nothing to do with the army.
Yeah.
And so I moved here at 25, made sure I could go straight to grad school and not have to participate in military service, and never looked back. This is home ever since.
Yeah. So did your father and your grandfather tell you stories about their experiences, or were they very...
So both of them were shell-shocked. From what I understand from the little interaction, my dad didn't stick around very long, unfortunately, or maybe for the better. But my father had been a tank commander in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and so he was not much of a daddy. I think my mother brought home a charming, handsome Israeli soldier to piss off her own father, but that doesn't necessarily add up to the most amicable marital situation. And so my old man had been really messed up fighting against the Egyptians in the south in the Sinai campaign in 1973. Exactly 50 years and a day to the October 7th attacks in 2023.
Oh, wow.
And so ironically, these things come in cycles and come back around again.
Yeah.
And so my old man had been pretty messed up from his war, and his father had also been a bit of a character. He fought originally with the British against the Germans, and then against the Arab armies in 1948, Israel's War of Independence. And so, ironically, having grown up in a very left-wing American, progressive, liberal household, I had a father and a grandfather from the other side of the family that were very intense. And I didn't get many stories. I had to kind of ask my dad's army buddies a little bit after he had passed away, like, why was my old man so messed up? And they gave me a little bit of insight into some of his scars and his wounds.
Yeah, that's nice someone was able to give you, because that's the kind of question that you ask your whole life, so it's nice that you were able to get a little bit of answers.
Yeah, why was daddy such a terrible daddy?
Yeah.
And from what I understood, like, they went charging into battle, both piecing it together from what I know about the history of the war itself and from some of his guys from his unit. They charged into battle when the Egyptians had rocket launching laser pointed new technology from the Russians that just tore us to pieces.
Oh, wow.
So we kind of went in super cocky and thinking that we're going to just steamroll them like we had done 6 years earlier in the Six-Day War, and they just tore these guys to pieces until we figured out how to deal with it. But it was an ugly war for the first couple weeks.
Yeah. I imagine knowing that really informs your view of the current conflict. Would you say? Like having for someone like me, very much wars exist in the history books. You know, like my grandfather fought in World War II, but he never said a thing about it, and I never heard anything about it. So it still very much remains something sort of veiled that exists only in books, and I can't quite wrap my head around it. Do you think it makes...
It's interesting. Where I have a lot of. I'm a tour guide here in Israel, if I haven't mentioned, and so I have this great role of being able to revisit and examine and travel around places and talk about heavy subjects. But I make a point that Jews don't do history; we do memory.
Yeah.
And so there's a lived, experiential kind of a historical analysis that isn't just necessarily pouring through history books, but when you walk on battlefields and you say, "Oh, this is where my father fought," or "This is where my grandfather fought," or "This is where they fought last month," it has this internalized kind of an emotional engagement with topics that, yeah, it exists in the history books, but it also kind of leaves this intergenerational scar or like mark on your heart.
Yeah.
And so, very much so. I mean, because I didn't have much of a dad, and because I didn't have a grandfather either, for that matter, that had any direct impact on my life, there's a lot of filling in the blanks with narrative. And so you study information, or you hear stories, or you kind of fill in the blanks, and then there's an emotional kind of engagement that you kind of fill in.
Yeah.
And so it allows me to kind of engage with the war that's taking place right now, hopefully with a little bit more insight, both emotional and intellectual. But it's interesting to kind of see how these things affect you, and see how all of a sudden you realize, like, wow, my heart is a little bit too like engaged, or I'm too vulnerable, or I'm a little bit overwhelmed. And it's part of the experience of living here. It's this constant engagement and constantly being overwhelmed and constantly being connected, whether it's your neighbors who are going off to fight, or if it's their families who are staying back to try to be protected. And it's just this constant whirlwind of intensity that you don't always know how to process properly.
Yeah. And also, you were saying about Jews don't know history, they live it. Also, just every single religious holiday in the Jewish canon is a memory of something bad that's happened. Is kind of...
It's...
Or a commemoration.
Someone told me once, like, Christians get to celebrate victories. We celebrate defeats. And so we have this, like, kind of... It's an oversimplification to say, like, oh, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, is like the summary of 2/3 of the Jewish holidays. Yeah. But there's a little truth to the oversimplification. We're taught to remember, like, we were there I was there when I walked out of Egypt, and I was there on the walls of Jerusalem when the Romans invaded, and I was there in the ghettos in Warsaw, and so, like, there's this, like, notion of narrative that's kind of woven amongst our peoplehood, and trying to place ourselves into these stories. And so we retell every year. We reread the Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, and we talk about, again, another one of these cliche stories of they tried to kill us and we survived. It's overly simplistic. It's overly black and white and kind of, but like the nuance and picking apart these stories, and you know, I mean, some of the details, the devil's in the details, and the details are great. It's part of who we are and how we are and what we are, but that lived memory is very special. And it's a little bit difficult because you're like, well, I want to extract myself from this cycle of violence and vengeance and bloodletting and horror. But history reminds us that maybe it doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And so we're reliving this once again.
And it's very much, there's this real attitude in in America that, you know, it's in the past, it's over, whatever, let's be present in the moment, and we're different than them. And we've sort of been, whereas I don't think that Jews have been allowed to think like that.
Interesting. Yeah, the past is never in the past. Yeah. I mean, like, we're constantly bringing the past into the present and putting our present into the past. And so how do we contextualize and like rationalize what's happening now in the long canon of history? I mean, like, you see these kind of silly, obnoxious comments sometimes online when I waste my energy arguing with people. It's just the biggest waste of energy.
It is.
When I could just be here talking to you.
Yeah.
but in-depth conversation and long-form content, unfortunately, is what's necessary rather than little quotes and like jabs. But like people say,
Yeah.
"Oh, Israel was promised to you 3,000 years ago. Like you're usurpers," and I'm like, listen, we see history from a very long arch.
Yeah.
And so, like, I look at my personal history of however old I am, 43 years, but it also fits into this, like this. It's a placeholder of a long history that goes back to before King David. And so, when I talk about Avraham Avinu, like Abraham, like I'm not talking about some guy that's 3,000 years ago. I'm talking about somebody who, like, I emotionally have a relationship with. I think about that whole notion of like even his name, like he changes his name from Abraham to Avraham, like from Abram to father to Abraham, which means father of many. But I kind of play with the letters a little bit when I tell the story, and I say Avrachamim, father of mercy. He had mercy on his son by not sacrificing Isaac, or if you're a Muslim, Ishmael. Depends on who you ask. But that notion of child sacrifice, and like in the historical context, you're talking about Canaanites who used to actually practice child sacrifice, and then you talk about today, as we send our sons and daughters off to war to fight and unfortunately maybe sacrifice them, the story becomes very present and relevant to the present circumstances. And so there's that identification with our ancestors and our forefathers and foremothers. Um, and it's not just some story from the past. It's something that like we re-examine every year when we reread the Torah, but every day when we talk about fathers and sons going off to battle and like what does it mean to be a father of mercy? What is the message of Abraham supposedly coming to Canaan to teach these people not to sacrifice children when unfortunately we are still sacrificing children, whether it's my enemy's children, whether it's my own children. It's a surreal kind of a cyclical horror and wonder. You know what I mean? Maybe the message was powerful and profound, and yet it hasn't properly been internalized by the actions that let us separate ourselves from our history. And so we're forced to still sacrifice children in this part of the world, and not for very good reasons, I don't think.
So what made you, are you the only member of your family that, your father was from Israel. Are you the only
My
one
father was from Israel.
that made
He
Aliyah?
he ran back to he went to America. He got his hands on a visa and met a nice American Jewish girl and managed to stick around in the U.S. for all of 15 minutes. But like again, he had his demons and his scars, and so he was dealing with his PTSD through drugs and alcohol until the grave.
Okay.
My older brother had something to prove with a father like this, and so he came to Israel, and I kind of followed him over here, and he ended up back in the U.S. And so each one of us, for our different reasons, I went running away to get away from a life that wasn't for me, and he came running to prove to his dad that he was also a good soldier. And so
Yeah.
these things also have this intergenerational complexity of what we're doing moving here. I moved to Israel because I was running away, and he moved here because he had a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah.
And so I ran away to South America, where all the Israelis go after the army.
Right.
And I bumped into them down there, and I was just like, you know what? I want this. Like, I wanted South America for escapism and nihilism and debauchery. But when it came time to kind of play my cards, it was either go back to the U.S., it was either stay in South America, or option number 3 that was on the table was follow these charming Israeli backpackers who had similar faces and similar names to me, and see what my fate would be in the homeland.
Yeah.
So having grown up in a liberal, lefty, kind of anti-Zionistic maybe household, I thought I'd test the waters and challenge my fate and look for something that would be a little bit more engaging than working in the booze business in Boston.
Yeah, yeah. So when we lived together in Israel 15 years ago, there were quite a few of our American Jewish classmates who were making Aliyah. And I think you might be one of the only ones who's still there.
It's not easy to live here.
Yeah.
I mean, I say it's a great place to visit. Don't ever move here. It's like the
Yeah.
best mistake I ever made.
So what's the decision been like to decide to stay, to make a go of it and stay there?
I'll give you a joke. They say when you move to Israel in your early 20s, you move here and you get an apartment and you have a crappy couch that you found on the street, and your buddies come over from America and they stay on your crappy couch and they sleep in your crappy apartment, and life is good because you're in your early 20s and it doesn't, what do you need? You don't need a whole lot. And then 20 years later, when you go back to America to visit the same friends, you go stay in their guest bedroom and their fancy houses and their big, charming villas or whatever, and you still have the same crappy apartment and the same
Yeah.
crappy couch. And so you make material sacrifices.
Yeah.
I love where I live. You know, I think there's a cute one-liner that says Judaism is not a religion; it's a relationship. And so we have a very profound relationship to this place. I mean, we fight hard for it, unfortunately, but I think regardless of what the naysayers want to think about the Jewish people in this land, it is profound and it is community oriented and it's family oriented and it is a wonderful place to raise kids when there's not rockets falling out your window. I mean, my daughter speaks 3 languages and she goes to a school that mixes religious and secular kids. And I teach her Arabic so that she can like schmooze with our other neighbors so that she doesn't get to engage with as much. And so for all the horrors and the nightmares, and extra money that goes to therapy because our entire society's got PTSD, it's an amazing place to raise kids. It's got good public transportation. My health insurance is wonderful. My Jewish school that gives my kid both Torah and secular education would cost me a fortune in the US that I doubt I'd be able to provide.
Yeah.
And so you take the good and the bad and the ugly and you mix it all together and try to make it work for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I don't know how to say this. How do you deal with the complexity of a lot of people don't quite understand how much Israelis and their government have sort of a push-pull relationship. How do you sort of deal with the complexity of, you know, the debate among Israelis about how to make your country the best country that you can?
Yeah. I very much respect the fact that for a year and a half before the war ever broke out in October of 2023, a lot of us were in the streets protesting.
Yeah.
And there's a certain challenge when it comes to the fact that I didn't join the protests. I was very much empathetic to why they were in the streets, and I still define myself as center left, even though the whole country has shifted right. But I respect our civic democracy, and I respect the fact that people were in the streets upset over the fact that my government tried to shove a judicial reform down our throats that was poorly rolled out. And at the same time, I also understood why the government felt the need for judicial reform, because we have one of the strongest Supreme Courts in the world. Out of any democracy, I think we have just about the strongest Supreme Court that has got tremendous powers that are a little bit eccentric. And so I'm using this as an example because we have a weak democracy. We only have one chamber of parliament and we have a Supreme Court and that's it. We don't have a Bill of Rights. We don't have a constitution. We don't have 2 chambers of parliament. And so we have basic laws that are amended every 5 minutes. We have a very weak institutional democracy. It's still a democracy. People want to hold their noses up at us, but it's still democracy. But it's weak. And so it can be easily manipulated and easily undermined. And so my parliament, that is becoming more and more right-wing, is upset with the fact that the Supreme Court, which is fairly left-wing, doesn't reflect the rightward shift of the population. And so this back and forth duel between the courts and the parliament were playing out in the streets before the war broke out. And there's a lot of us who are, the joke is that like we love democracy so much that we had 5 elections in 2 years leading up to the war. It's exhausting. And it's a reflection of the fact that we still believe in the institutions and the values and the virtues of our 80-year-old democracy, however weak it may be. And so, I mean, you would see people in the streets who are opposing the government and who are challenging the government and I mean, the irony is most of us acknowledged that we needed judicial reform, that it needed to happen, that we needed to re-examine these institutions to be able to make them stronger and better. Not necessarily a more empowered check and balance, but like a healthy kind of counterweight to the parliamentary system. And so most of us agreed that there needed to be judicial reform. We just didn't like how the government was going about delivering it. And so it was a decapitation instead of a referendum.
Right.
And so the protesters were out there with Israeli flags. They weren't saying burn down the state and like shaking our fists. We're shaking our fists, but it wasn't about burn down the system. It was about roll things out with a little dignity. Like, you know what I mean? Don't shove it down our throats, but give us a chance to kind of voice our civic uh, opposition, but understanding that like things needed to be reformed, not like decapitated. And so we dance and duel with our government, and we have a very, very engaged civic society that wants to improve our country, not have it kind of go the way of the dodo and weaken these democratic institutions that are few and far between. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of taking to the streets, begging, not begging, but like fighting, like, no, 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 we need a constitution. We need judicial reform that's dignified, not just like, tell me what I have to do and expecting to fall in line. This is a very, here's a good example is that the majority of the population of Israel, 90% of Israel, are themselves refugees or children of refugees. And Jews in Eastern Europe were very independent. You know what I mean? We're merchants and traders and tailors. And so we're not used to the hierarchy of a corporate structure. And so that means that trying to get our people to like fall in line is not easy. And so you say, oh, this is what judicial reform is going to look like. Deal with it. And we're like, no, 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 that's not going to work for us. And so shaking our fist at the man is a huge part of kind of our very autonomous, independent nature as Jews of the Eastern world.
Yeah.
I'll put it out there like that.
So when I talked recently to a friend of mine who's a anti-Zionist and a hard activist for Gaza, and one of her complaints was, so she believes that Israel has a right to exist, but she doesn't believe in an ethno-state. So she doesn't believe that you should be allowed to have a Jewish state, that you should have an open democracy, and that everyone should be allowed to vote. And I wonder, and then because part of the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, it means that anytime you criticize the Israeli government, you get accused of anti-Semitism. Because the ethnicity and the politics are tied together, you can't criticize the politics without also criticizing the ethnicity. Tell me what you say to that sort of argument.
So I think there's a lot of well-meaning activism that's coming out of Canada, the US, Europe, the West, this is whatever you want to call it, Australia. I think to some extent they have reasonably good intentions, and they're upset over, from a humanist perspective, when they see the horrors that like my country has thrust upon Gaza. We didn't start this war, but like we certainly fought it with a lot of vigor and horror and bombs and dead kids. And so if you're not upset by that, you're probably a jerk. I think this whole ethno-state argument is a little bit silly. Japan is an ethno-state. Germany is an ethno-state. Like, it's a modern term. These are modern academic, post-colonialist like ideas that are brand new to academia, that all of a sudden this activist class of pseudo-intellectuals is starting to use this terminology with very less than subtle, I wouldn't say anti-Semitic undertones, but like, I think this distinction between saying, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. What a bullshit kind of like a notion. I don't hate Jews for their ethnicity, I hate Jews for their state. Well, ultimately, you know what I mean? Like, to some extent, I think it's a silly workaround in order to be able to go after Jews. I mean, you don't like my Jewish state? Sorry. But like, after total genocide in Europe and after absolute ethnic cleansing of every Jew from the Middle East, we need a place to call home. I don't trust the Europeans, and I don't trust the Christian world, and I don't trust the Muslims, and I don't trust the Arab world with my safety. And so if you're going to say, oh, we should all just have equal voting rights in some utopian pluralistic democracy, show me where that exists in the Middle East. Show me where Jews are safe, let alone Jews. Where are Christians safe in Muslim majority countries? There's 57 Muslim majority countries across the Middle East and Asia and in Africa. And there are dozens of Christian countries that got crosses on their flags. But for some reason, this utopian idealism seems to only be carried out with one certain state in focus. And so while your friend may probably have lots of good intentions and liberal aspirations when it comes to what would be best both for Israelis, Jews, and for Palestinian, Arab, Muslim Christians, I think it's a little bit naive. And by a little bit, I mean massively naive. Because you see what happens in multi-ethnic states like Syria, and how well they're doing, and states like Iraq and how poorly they're doing. And that ultimately, I simply don't trust my Muslim cousins. And I can't afford to risk my neck and my kid's neck over finger wagging from Europe. If the, my neighbors here in this region are telling me we're going to kill you unless you're strong, versus the Europeans who are going to say we're going to shake our finger at you and condemn you if you're too strong, I'll listen to the locals. I care less about what the Canadian Liberal has to say about me and my ethno-state. If it means I have her condemnation versus my cousins who are telling me from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Islamic Jihad, from a dozen other organizations, we're going to effing kill you. I'll take their comments a little bit more seriously than I take the Canadian Liberal.
So how does a person criticize the state of Israel? Just don't?
No, of course you do. The fact that we're in the streets yelling and screaming at our government.
Well, that's Israelis, yeah. But how do
Israelis?
Yeah, how do non-Jews criticize the government of Israel without being anti-Semitic?
I wish they could. It's not that difficult to criticize policy, to criticize like how we're managing this war, how like without saying ultimately you don't have a right to a national home. Okay. The Jewish people need a national home. Zionism has evolved. It wasn't a static entity. You know what I mean? Ahad Ha'am, some of the early philosophers of Zionism are like, all the Jews are running out of Russia, going to America. Build Zion in America. And so different ideas, you know what I mean? Early Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharet, their idea was to plead with the Turks and the Ottoman government for a semi-autonomous regional entity in this area. It wasn't necessarily a national state for the Jewish people. It evolved into that when we realized nothing else was going to happen. But I think the idea that our naysayers can criticize policy and procedure and our governments and lots of wonderful reasons to criticize Israel without ultimately undermining the notion that we deserve a state for our own. You know what I mean? If you don't like ethno-states, then like I don't see anyone shaking their fist at Japan, which is 99% Japanese. Whereas there's 2 million Palestinians who live in Israel with full citizenship. The only difference between me and them on paper, I'm talking about within the state of Israel, not in the West Bank and Gaza, but like the 2.3 million Palestinian, vast majority, 95% of whom are Muslims, the only difference between me and them on paper is that I have immigration rights to the state of Israel and they don't. And so they can't bring their cousin from Syria or from Lebanon to move here, whereas I could theoretically ask my cousin who has Jewish heritage to move into Israel. Otherwise, on paper, same taxes, same legal reality. I think what a lot of people in the West, who from like your friend are probably good humanists who simply don't like seeing babies blown up, fail to acknowledge that they're marching in lockstep with some very nefarious characters who are less well-intentioned. I think they fail to acknowledge to some extent that they're partners in these marches and in this Stop the War movement aren't in it for Palestine. They don't care as much about the suffering of the Palestinians as much as your friend does. They're in it to destroy my state. So the question is, how do you criticize Israeli policy without stepping into the minefield of anti-Semitism? It's very possible. But I think like saying, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm simply anti-Zionist is, well, okay, you want to, what does that mean you're anti-Zionist? You want Israel to no longer be a state for the Jewish people. And I have a problem with that because I'm not safe in any other state. I'm not comfortable living in Spain because they're horrifically anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. You know what I mean? I think ultimately at the end of the day, one or the other has the same outcome. It's violence against Jews. Maybe it's political violence. Maybe it's rhetorical violence. Maybe it's semantics about, well, we're not hating on you because of your race, we're hating on you because your country is carrying out human rights violations. And that's a legitimate hatred. You know what I mean? If you hate Israel because we're carrying out horrific violence against the Palestinians, I completely understand that. But if it means you're saying to me, you're not entitled or we're not allowed to have our state for our people, that's where we're going to butt heads. Because for 15 million Jews that are left in the world, half of whom live in Israel, so you're saying, oh, I don't hate Jewish people, I hate Zionism or Zionists. Well, that's half the Jewish people. And 90% of Jews are Zionistic because my people have had a relationship to this land for thousands of years. So if that's a problem for you, that's your problem because I can't afford to like let your problems undermine my safety and my child's security.
If Israel was no longer a Jewish state, if it was just opened up and everybody in Israel was suddenly an equal citizen, what do you believe would be lost?
We built an amazing project over here. Like the Jewish state of Israel, while that rubs the, we could change the name to Palestine. I couldn't care less. But ultimately, there is something to be said for Jewish culture that is thriving here. It's under attack, it's under bombardment, we're like a little bit paranoid, we all need therapy, but Jewish life here is rich, it is diverse, it of the world that are thriving in Israel.
Hold on, Amir. I can't hear anything.
There we go.
Yeah.
Are we back?
Yes.
All
Okay.
right.
I missed your whole wonderful answer.
So let me dive back in and simply say that like what would be lost if Israel was no longer a Jewish state is the fact that this is the only place in the world, as far as I can tell, where Jewish life is properly thriving. You know what I mean? We are a people of survival and like maintaining our small communities in other people's lands. But the sad reality is that there was rich Jewish culture from Morocco to Marrakesh to Iran that's gone. It's disappeared. It was ethnically cleansed from North Africa and the Middle East. And Jewish life in America is shrinking and dying and disappearing, with the exception of a few pockets of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn and a couple other places in LA, maybe. But this is all that's left. And what we've done over here, in spite of the wars and the reality of the bellicose Middle East, is create a vibrant, rich society. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just about, you know, I'm furious at my government for not letting us have public transportation on Saturday. But there's a part of me that also kind of like appreciates the Jewish character.
Yeah.
Our tech ecosystem, our cultural society, our culinary scene, our multilinguistic, our multi-ethnic. This country is vibrant. It's rich in so many ways. And it's all we got left.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I wish I could have visited some of the shtetls in Romania where some of my family's from, or the villages in Iraq. Baghdad used to be 40% Jewish up until 100 years ago. It's all gone.
Yeah.
And so you're telling me I have to like also put Israel on the chopping block in my head along with it in order to placate the least pragmatic people that there ever has been. I have a lot of love for my Palestinian cousins. I learn their language. I appreciate so many things about them. But as a political community, they're the least pragmatic people I've ever had to deal with. And maybe they are, I don't know, we can talk about that. But like, I don't really want to put what we've created here up for grabs and in some utopian vision that liberals have with regards to how we should all live and what we should all do with our like kumbaya. It doesn't exist in the Middle East. Christians aren't safe in the Middle East any more than Yazidis or Assyrians or Copts. You know what I mean? Like these minority populations, the Druze are chased all over the place and massacred. And so you're telling me like the Jewish homeland needs to be put up on the pedestal of utopianism that doesn't exist in the East, let alone in the West? No, thank you. Sorry. Like I want to figure out pragmatic solutions for my Palestinian cousins because they deserve something. And keeping them under occupation isn't good for me any better. It's obviously not good for them. But like the give and take, the carrot and the stick, the pragmatism. My cousins draw a very hard line based on what they think they're entitled to and based on the sacrifices that they need to make in order to swallow the bitter pill of having lost a war to Jews. And I think your friends in Canada don't understand honor and shame in the Muslim world when it comes to what it means to swallow that bitter pill. There's 2 billion Christians in the world and there's 2 billion Muslims in the world. And for hardline Arabs to have lost a war to you people, to the Christian world, okay, like there's a lot of them and there's a lot of us, and so we're kind of evenly matched. But to have lost to us acknowledges a certain defeat and shame that my cousins don't want to have to swallow that bitter pill. And it does them a disservice to not have to face that fact. Oh, we've lost the battle, not the war. oh, the next round we'll have victory, but digs them deeper and deeper into this defeat that they don't want to acknowledge. They've wasted decades and decades of resources and money and opportunity to build their own societies by building up a military that they can't afford to defeat my country, which constantly disappoints them in that engagement. And having to kind of face facts and deal with that bitter pill will be the best thing that they could ever do for themselves. There's a great speaker, Naz Daily, who's a Palestinian from Israel. And he said the most dangerous thing for a Palestinian is another Palestinian with an AK-47. It's not my army. I swear to God, like my army will be as lackadaisical as we ever wished we could be if our cousins gave us a hint that we can afford to be. But we thought we could get away with being a little bit like live and let live, and that we thought that Hamas wanted to raise children and direct traffic and build up Gaza. And we found out the hard way that that's not their number one priority. And so we'll have to learn the hard lessons. And it sucks because it turns us into more bellicose and more militarist than we want to be. But like these are hard lessons that we're going to have to learn when it comes to carrot and stick, and how on one hand we want to be, I don't want my kid to be a soldier and an officer in the army. I want her to be what Jews are supposed to be, nerdy bookkeepers and accountants and doctors and lawyers and inventors and scientists, because we're also really good at that. You know what I mean? But we're also really good at being soldiers. And I wish we weren't, but we are. And thank God we are. There's a bitter pill, a price to pay in that regard.
How do you feel about the idea? People argue that Israel's purpose is to reclaim Gaza and to make it part of Israel. What do you think about that?
What a catastrophe. It's interesting. I just had a great student tour that I led from a couple different campuses actually this last couple months. And we met with a journalist named Haviv Gur. He's got a good podcast called Ask Haviv Anything. But he's right after Israel, and he was talking about the different elections in the 90s that we elected. Ehud Olmert and Barak and all these different politicians, and around the idea of disengagement. You know what I mean? The Oslo Accords in 95 was about pulling out of the West Bank and letting the Palestinians rule themselves. And it ended in a lot of suicide bombings, 140 suicide bombings over 3 years that basically convinced the Palestinians that, convinced the Israelis that the Palestinians are not about to be a partner for peace. And so I think to some extent, the irony is that we talk about Bibi Netanyahu and a lot of people think he's a monster. The last person to sign a peace accord with the Palestinians was Bibi Netanyahu in the Wye River Accords in the early 2000s. And so he actually kept Oslo going, even though it eventually blew up in his face and blew up in all our faces. But it was Ariel Sharon in the early 2000s who was a general known as the Bulldozer for like being a ruthless, vicious man who my father had fought under in 1973 when he like charged and like surrounded the Third Army of the Egyptians. But he pulled out of Gaza because he said, this is not sustainable. This is not tenable. Like you can't have 8,000 Jews living amongst 1 million plus Gazans. It's just not reasonable. And so the unanimous, or not the unanimous, what's the word? The unilateral pullout from Gaza, unfortunately, was maybe had good intentions, but like when it's not negotiated on both sides, the other side saw it as a power play. I mean, we pulled out because they forced us out. The same thing happened in southern Lebanon, where we left southern Lebanon. It was a buffer zone up until the early 2000s for 20 years after the Lebanon war that started out in 1982, where Israel occupied or militarily dominated southern Lebanon in order to keep rockets flying over the border. And when we pulled back because we're like, this is no longer sustainable and practical, it was a victory for Hezbollah, who then keeps coming forward. And so there's a dilemma of like everywhere we pull back, the feeling is that we're pulling back and it's going to be matched with this further encroachment or further, wherever you pull back, we're going to keep pushing forward. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very difficult dilemma. I know this is a roundabout answer to your question, but the idea of recolonizing or reoccupying or resettling Gaza is just a bad joke. But you asked the reasonable question because the people who are advocating for this are very well organized and they're very serious. The settler movement, which has a lot of stigma in the West, for Jewish people who are choosing to live in the West Bank, the Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call it, the big prize is the West Bank when it comes to this whole reality. And so there are already 500,000 plus minus, depends on how you talk about, Jews who are living over the Green Line in the West Bank, in that territory, in communities, some of which are neighborhoods of Jerusalem, some of which are deep into the hill country of Judea and Samaria, way surrounded by massive Arab cities. Some of them are designed specifically to encircle Jerusalem in order to be able to cut it off from West Bank Palestinian communities. But the settler movement is very organized and is very proactive in the government and has a lot of support in the government. I mean, my finance minister is an idiot. But Bezalel Smotrich is a terrible finance minister, but he is very, very savvy when it comes to using and manipulating the instruments of state to further that settlement project. I wish it didn't have to be so controversial. You know, I mean, the fact that there's 2 million Palestinians living in Israel isn't that big a deal to me. I like them for the most part. They are, you know, I mean, the last year there were more nurses from Palestinian families that graduated nursing school in Israel than Jewish families. And so, like, they're climbing the food chain and they're working their way up, and they have some of the highest GDPs of any populations in the Arab world. But the idea of Jews living in the West Bank is somehow seen as horrific and basically for the Palestinian population. That's just a stupid non-reality for Jews. You know what I mean? The facts on the ground of how much damage and destruction has been caused from this war in Gaza makes the question of whether Palestinians are going to be able to redevelop their society also a big question mark. And so, you know what I mean? Let alone, like, the idea of Jews moving into Gaza is just it's silly. I mean, maybe there's a few fanatics who talk about it like it's a practical step, but it's not going to happen. There's no energy whatsoever for that. The question is there going to be enough energy for Palestinians to be able to resettle Gaza? There is no rebuilding Gaza with Hamas is in charge. There is no rebuilding Lebanon, Hezbollah in charge. And so these are bigger questions than just Gaza. The whole region is relying on dust to settle from this war. It's a huge question mark for Israel to be able to. I mean, the war.
Sorry, Amir, your mic is doing it again. It's getting choppy again.
The $1 million question that we're talking about is Israel has won the war. You know what I mean? Whether it's Lebanon or Syria or sadly Gaza, which is a disaster, or Iran for that matter. What are we gonna be able to win the peace? And so it's the $1 million question about what happens now. You know what I mean? The dust is settling and the ceasefire is falling into place. We've had a ceasefire with Lebanon for the last year, and we attack Lebanon every day. We are on average killing an operative of Hezbollah every day in southern Lebanon. And you can say, well, there's a ceasefire, you're not supposed to do that. I'm sorry if it's cynical, but up until the last 2 years ago, Israel had a gun pointed at its head, whether it's 150,000 rockets from Lebanon or whether it's Iranian ballistic missile programs. But the ring of fire of the Iranian regime in the Islamic Revolution was trying to choke off Israel, and Israel basically defeated that entity. We've had, and so the question now is, are they going to just try the same game all over again, or are we going to try to do something a little bit different? But Israel is not going to let our enemies rearm and reorganize and regroup, and I hope not. I hate to say it. Like, if it means that we're cynically attacking Lebanon once a day to let them know that they're not going to be shipping weapons from the Bekaa Valley down into the south of the country, then, like, I'm in favor. Until, like, my enemies have a little bit more practical and pragmatic, like, ideas other than just more of the same war, then, like, I hope we let them know that we're going to manage that war better than we have before. There are voices in Lebanon right now, maybe they're more Christian voices or Druze voices, who are saying, Israel, you just did the best thing we ever could have asked you for, as horrible as that is, because now Lebanon has a chance to be free of Hezbollah, which was holding the state hostage. And Iran was using, Iran has been fighting Israel to the last Arab standing, if you get the reference. The Persian Iranians are happy to use the Arabs as pawns in this game against Israel. They're not fighting to free Palestine. And so, like, this is, again, that doubling back to, like, well-intentioned humanist Western liberals and human rights workers like your friend, who I'm sure has nothing but good intentions. But like, she's also working together, whether she wants to acknowledge it or not, with some very nefarious, like jihadi institutions that are not so progressive and pluralistic when it comes to how they feel about Jews, let alone Christians or gays or women, maintaining a lifestyle that I would like to maintain.
Do you think that how can you hope for peace when you know full well that anybody who survives in Gaza will forever hate Israel?
Forever's a big word.
Yeah.
Always and never and forever and these very like absolutist terms are problematic because the Palestinian, you know what I mean? Like the Palestinian population, the 2 million Arabs who live as my neighbors here in Israel, I wouldn't say they're gung ho pro Zionists, but they live here. They're part of the state. They are Zionists, whether they want to say it out loud, because they are in favor of maintaining like the structure and the order and the society that like serves them and that they serve. You know what I mean? There are Muslim women in my army, and there are Druze men in my army, and there are Christians. The Christian and the Bedouin conscription in the Israeli army has tripled in the last year. There's a lot of people who are not Jewish who are doubling down and tripling down on Israel because they're like the alternative is terrifying. And so what do I do about the Palestinians? Like it's carrot and stick. There needs to be gestures from Israel that are both reminding my cousins that we have a big muscle and a lot of strength, but then we also have what to offer when it comes to incentives to cooperation and getting along. I think my cousins use an absolutist outlook of it was all ours and you stole it all from us, and I think it's missing a lot of nuance when it comes to a lot of elements of our right and our indigeneity and our homeland. I mean, it's almost embarrassing, I think, for them sometimes to say that the Jews have no rights or no privilege or no legitimacy here in the Holy Land. I'm like, nonsense. And so, just as much as it's embarrassing and silly for Jews to say the same thing about Palestinians. And so, I think to some extent, you have two national movements fighting over one piece of territory, and we're both going to have to get a little bit more creative and also be a little bit more pragmatic and also face facts because their militarism has not worked for them. We thought we were working towards peace in the 90s and the early 2000s, and Israel probably needed to make more sacrifices than we did make if we were going to be taken seriously as like a partner in peace. But like if you're telling me on one hand that we're talking about peace and on the other hand you're building suicide vests, then like both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, supposedly the moderate of the whole equation, the PA that rules the West Bank right now, albeit very weakly, they missed a tremendous opportunity. The Palestinians never waste an opportunity to waste an opportunity. And so the opportunity of all of Greater Palestine being entirely Arab is a pipe dream. And so again, maybe facing facts on one side, kind of lowering the rhetoric to some extent, re-examining textbooks just like the Saudis have done and just like they've done in Dubai and the UAE when it comes in Abu Dhabi, saying that, listen, like if you're teaching your kids that the Jews are the devil and they stole Palestine from you, then like of course they're going to be my enemies forever. But if you can also take a look at like the fact that guess what, like there were different threads and different opportunities throughout history that the Palestinians missed. That means swallowing a bitter pill. It means putting some blame at home as well as pointing the finger at the Israelis, and then we can start to compromise from a place of more pragmatic rationalism. You know what I mean? If you want to talk about, like, for example, the Husseinis versus the Nashashibis in the 1930s, there were two different clans, two different families in Jerusalem with tremendous power and influence over the fate of the Palestinian Arab population. And one side said, we need to be pragmatic, we need to be compromising, we need to figure out where to oppose the Jews and where to work with the Jews. And the other side said violence and absolutism. And that's who took over their national movement, and it led them to disaster. And so, like, I want to appeal to the pragmatists and the rational audience in the Palestinian camp. They just don't have any power because the doubling down on violence has been the name of the game since the beginning, and it's just been a disaster for them. And so I don't care what they think they're entitled to. I want to hear what they're willing to to what they want to get out of this whole equation. You have the most savvy country that is Israel, whether you like it or not, that exists right here. Like, work with us, because we got water tech and biotech and food tech and all kinds of global energy green tech that the world desperately needs, and the Arabs especially, because this neighborhood is getting hotter and hotter with global warming. That, you know what I mean? Like, are you going to work with us and like enjoy the fruits of our ingenuity, or are you going to work against us and like deal with the implications of our army? It's their choice.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of choices in this situation about how they choose to engage with us. But the whole like all or nothing is just a waste of their time, because we're doing fine. You know what I mean? As ugly as this war has been, like, I'm a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Like 1,200 dead without pissing on the graves of the people who I've been crying and mourning and burying over the last year or 2 years, including a brother, including friends. Like, we'll get through this. You know what I mean? Like, the Jewish people have gotten through worse than this. But will the Arabs? Will my cousins recover from this? Or are they going to just play the same games over and over again? And instead of the Iranians shooting missiles at me, it's going to be the Turks next year. Okay, we'll defeat the Turks too, just like we've defeated the Iranians, and they'll go from bad to worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, are they able to have enough pragmatic voices that are going to shout down the bellicose screamers? There's a great quote from Israeli politician Einat Wilf, and she started a new political party that's probably not going to have so much success because it's too pragmatic for Israel right now. That's being ridiculously irrational sometimes and right wing. But she was quoting Lord Bevan, the last chancellor or viceroy or whatever you want to call from the British Empire that was ruling over mandatory Palestine up until 1947-48, and he said, "We have an irreconcilable problem in that." What the Jews want is a home, a state, a country. And what the Arabs most want is for the Jews not to have a state or a country. Mm. And so the second they want a country for themselves, if they really wanted a country, they would have had it by now. We built institutions and quasi-governmental organizations and national this and land purchasing that and banking this and health insurance that, so that when the time came, we had all those things in place to be able to then win a war and start running a government. The Palestinians haven't built any of that stuff. Their institutions are super weak. And so just like at the beginning of this conversation, I was talking about my country lacking a constitution and lacking some of the necessary institutions of a successful democracy. We're still a successful democracy in spite of having weak institutions. But the Palestinians haven't built any of that stuff. And so if you want a two-state solution, then like maybe start building up the institutions of state, or of good governance, or of, you know what I mean? Like, they have a ministry of X, Y, and Z in Ramallah, but I don't think they have any actual tangible efficacy. Mm. And so I think my cousins have what to prove. If they're actually going to be partners of peace, they're going to have to start serving their own society with a little bit more institutional pragmatism. Because otherwise it's going to be more of the same. And again, I don't want to risk what we've built here, hoping that maybe they'll step up to the plate and be willing to start playing this game of statesmanship and brinksmanship.
Mm-hmm. Although I'm sure you do recognize in a lot of ways it's hard to build a functioning government when
the Israelis are doing what the Israelis do best. Divide and conquer, 100%.
Yeah.
I'm not naive. Cruelty is the name of the game when it comes to winning wars. You don't win wars without cruelty, and there's no such thing as a war without war crimes. And my country has committed war crimes, and my country is brilliantly horrible at cruelty and warfare. As a roundabout answer to the fact that, yes, we make it easy. They make it very easy to divide and conquer. And so I think there's a certain naivete when it comes to how cohesive and how united the wahda of the Palestinian people actually is. I think the one thing that unites the Palestinians is their opposition to Israel. But if you're only anti-something, how pro-Palestine are you really? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I'm very nervous that, like, if there was a free Palestine tomorrow, it would turn on itself in a second. There's a professor from Haifa named Dan Shuftan, and he's a little bit realist and what do you call it, the Hobbesian. But he said, listen, for all the faults and the shortcomings of the Jewish state, after 75 years or 80 years, however old we are, the Moroccan Jews marry the Polish Jews, who marry the Iranian Jews, who marry the German Jews. We're all intermingled. I went to an Ethiopian Russian Jewish wedding a couple of years ago, and it was beautiful. We intermarry because we all see ourselves as part of the greater state of Israel and the Jewish Israeli community. The Jabari clan from Hebron does not marry with the Hosseinis, who do not marry with the Ismailis, who do not marry like. And so I wonder to some extent the anti-Israelism of Palestine is one aspect of their culture and their identity. And I wonder from a national point of view or a state kind of construct how cohesive they are. And so again, I'm simply shaking my head and questioning to some extent how much do they really want a state, and how much they really are interested not simply in the destruction of my state but in the building and the creation of their own.
Yeah. You must have spent some time trying to come to terms with the idea that of the disproportionateness of this war. You know, for every Israeli that's killed, there's 100 of Palestinians that are killed, and I think it's easy for people who have never had their lives threatened to point that out. You know that
everyone's a liberal. Everyone's a liberal until you've had a gun pointed at you and your kids.
Yeah,
which sucks. You're right. This is asymmetric warfare. You know, hats off to Hamas. They fought a very brilliant guerrilla warfare campaign. This has been a very successful ability for they're still standing. So, like, you know what I mean? Maybe they lost 60% of Gaza that my military now controls. The Gaza Strip, 140 square kilometers of territory, is now 60% in Israeli hands, and that population is squeezed now into even smaller territory than they were before. That being said, they've managed to hold back brilliantly one of the strongest armies in the region. And so, yeah, the body count is pretty brutal. We've lost 500 soldiers, 600 soldiers since the war started, not counting the losses on October 7th. I don't know the exact numbers, but you have if body count is how you're measuring things, you're missing a lot of the big picture in the context. And so I think you need to highlight the fact that, like, civilian casualties against Israel, whether it's suicide bombings from the 2000s or whether it was October 7th, were part of the intention. You know what I mean? To kill civilians was part of Hamas's strategy from the beginning, from the early 2000s till the war broke out. Whereas maybe we're callous and casual and not careful enough when it comes to attacking our military targets, and we've killed, I don't know, the numbers they're talking about 70,000 people altogether. I think the problem is that everyone takes that number 70,000. That's the actual number, and in all reality, it's probably pretty close, regardless if that's the number that comes from Hamas, and regardless of the fact that they don't count civilian casualties that they themselves cause or natural deaths. Give or take, plus minus, bodies under the rubble, it's probably 70,000. The $1 million question we have to ask is, how many of them are fighters and soldiers, and how many of them are civilians? Yes, Israel has killed, therefore, maybe 40,000, 50,000 civilians in the attempt to kill 25, 35,000 Hamas fighters. It's probably 2-1 civilians to soldiers is a rough guess. If Israelis are saying 1-1, that's bullshit. I don't believe my own government when it comes to that statistic. But I also think we have to acknowledge that there's a war right now in Russia and Ukraine where there's 1 million dead. And there's 2 years of warfare and 40,000 civilians maybe is an ugly number. According to the laws of war, when you target a high-level official or somebody, if we target Yahya Sinwar, or we're going after Mohammed Deif, and we say, based on the ranking of this individual or the strength of the target, we're allowed to potentially kill 20 civilians. I'm sure those numbers became even more sad and horrible during the war. But to some extent, Israel, if only paying lip service to international law, attempts to kill really bad people and unfortunately kill civilians in the process. And so the numbers are terrible. The numbers are horrible. But compared to what? Compared to the Americans and the Canadians in Fallujah when the American and the Canadian Army and NATO took out ISIS, the numbers were like 7 or 8 to 1, and no one cared. I think it's important to acknowledge that yes, civilian deaths are horrific. There's never been a tunnel system like Gaza's. There's never, ever been anything built in guerrilla warfare in the history of the world like what Hamas built underneath the Gaza Strip. It's a brilliant. We fought their war. This is what they wanted. They drew us in to fight the battle. But that is a place that had, we don't know the actual numbers, 800, 900 kilometers of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, with 251 Israeli hostages that were brilliant bargaining chip to be able to play out, with a place that was booby-trapped to pieces. It's a shame. Someone said to me once, why didn't you know what would have been the best weapon to humiliate Israel? Would be to build a park in the middle of Jerusalem in a Palestinian neighborhood. To build a playground in Gaza City. Instead of shipping AK-47s and weapons and grenade launchers, what if you built a peace park in the middle of Gaza to show how benevolent and how magnanimous and how peace-loving the Iranians are? It would have been a slap in the face because it would have made Israel look like a warmongering state that we sometimes are.
Yeah.
But like they didn't do that. They sent weapons. They sent bombs. And so Israel blew Gaza to bits because that's what happens when you fight urban combat and tunnel warfare. The ingenuity that went into digging those tunnels, like hats off to them. I wish they could have used that ingenuity towards something that would have been a little bit more beneficial to their own children. Because there's something like 40, 50,000 tunnel shafts coming up underneath people's homes, and there's no way to destroy that without destroying the homes on top. And when we send our messages of we're going to blow up this building or we're going to blow up and attack in this neighborhood, and the civilians clear out, maybe, hopefully, they also rig the whole place with weapons to try to get our guys. And so the fact is, if we've only lost 500 compared to their 50,000 civilians, 40,000 civilians, whatever the actual number is, we'll never know. We fought their war. And so maybe we fought it more intensely than they expected. I think Hamas never thought we would follow through the way we have. I think we probably should have stopped the war a year ago, which would have been a smart thing to do. But like, as much as I want to like throw up in my mouth singing any praise for Donald Trump, he did manage to get a ceasefire, and he did manage to get the Israeli hostages out, and he did manage to bring the war to an end. I said I'd kiss his ass for 2 weeks for that one, and then I'd go back to shaking my fist at the guy. But like, you don't defeat evil men with white gloves. And so I have no illusions about who my enemies are. And like, yeah, Israel's pretty damn cruel, but we're also scientists and doctors and lawyers and human rights advocates and have a free press that destroys and decimates my government while at the same time being grateful that the army is strong enough to keep Hamas and Islamic Jihad out of our kids' classrooms.
You said you have no illusions about who your enemies are. And I find it, this leads me to the last question that I want to ask you about the war, which is I always find it interesting that the Americans who support Israel, in theory, should really be Israel's enemies, because in a lot of cases, the American Christians who support Israel are quite anti-Semitic. And they support Israel out of their anti-Semitism. So I wonder what you think about that.
I think,
that
however
bedfellow.
anti-Semitic they are, they're probably, sadly, it's the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
It's like Marie Le Pen in France. She hates Jews. She's anti-Semitic, but she hates Muslims more.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's not exactly the best friend that I want. You know what I mean? I don't want these people loving up on me because they just happen to hate Muslims more. I think that's tragic and pitiful. Israel has some strange bedfellows. Whether it's the UAE, which is like a slaver state. You know what I mean? Like 90% of the population in Dubai are guest workers, which is a nice way to put like indentured servants. Jews have always had to kiss up to the king. It's how we stay alive and how we keep the mob and the masses from butchering us, like they do throughout history. And so we need patrons and we need allies. And whether that's other minorities in the Middle East, like the Christians and the Maronites and the Druze and the Bedouin in the south of Israel, who are allies to Israel. Maybe they're reluctant allies, but they support Israel because they acknowledge the nefarious nature of the masses, the Sunni Muslim like ulama that wants to create a maybe more Islamic state that the Iranians are promoting. When it comes to nefarious Christians in America, I think some of them are altruistic and some of them are more evangelical kind of end of days. They need the Jews to kind of come to the Holy Land so that the rapture can come. I wonder how much of that really influences people, or versus kind of weird characters like Charlie Kirk, who kind of acknowledge that, like, wait a second, the Jews are into big families and keeping a Sabbath and coming home on the weekends and kind of conservative traditional values. And there's something admirable about that. My society's not is fairly conservative. I mean, even the super lefties go home and light Shabbos candles with their parents on Friday night dinners. And so that family values, those big families, we're the only country in the West that still has an average of 3 children per woman in secular families. Forget the religious and the ultra-religious. And so there's something admirable about that. There's a balance between a technocratic and high-tech state while also being very traditional and conservative and like kind of family-oriented. I'm digressing from your question, but like, yeah, we have some nefarious friends, and I think like Israel will take support where we can get it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's. Am I more afraid of the anti-Zionist from the left versus the anti-Zionist from the right? I'm scared of both of them. I think they both are a little bit like the college kids and a lot of the protesters are without even realizing, they're saying, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist." Yeah, you are. You just don't realize it, and that there's a lot of kind of boogeyman and attaching all kinds of evil in the world that's associated with Jews. I think, like, yeah, unfortunately, Jeffrey Epstein was Jewish, but so was Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah.
And so I think we can create some monsters, and we also can create some heroes.
Just like everybody else.
Yeah, like every other community. I think that, like, because we're small and because we stick out so much, because we are bred for like studying in Talmud since we were like back in the shtetl. I think it's an easy mirror for your own societies. You know what I mean? What's going on in Canada and what's going on in the United States is upsetting, and you're seeing democratic institutions falling and failing, and you're seeing society kind of tearing at itself. I went back to the U.S. for the first time in years. I lived for a couple months to take a mental health break in Colorado, and I could feel the nervous energy, that like lack of confidence and faith in the society. And I think rather than dealing with the fact that America needs immigration reform, it needs to reform its tax codes desperately, it's easier to find a boogeyman. It's easier to blame complicated problems of dynamic societies on some outsider that's saying, "Oh, well, it's all Israel."
Yeah.
It's just a cop out. But it's a cop out that society's used for centuries. The Jews are always a great whipping boy and a scapegoat.
Okay, last question.
Here we go.
You're a tour guide. Who are you
Yes.
giving tours to? Is there a lot of tourists coming to Israel right now?
No, I am broke as a joke.
Oh, no.
But listen, my grandpa lost everything and he built himself back up again. And my great grandfather had the same thing when he ran from the Russians. And so, like, I'll build myself back up again and lick my wounds and save for the next year's vacation because I can't afford one this year. Right now, there is political delegations that are slowly coming back. There are colleges and campuses that want to come and see and hear about what's happening. There are Jewish communities that want to come back now that it's maybe sort of kind of almost safe enough. Hopefully the Iranian situation will, who knows? Maybe Israel has to eat a few more missiles in order for the Iranian regime to fall. And who knows if that's a reasonable sacrifice. There's Christian communities that are slowly coming back. The numbers are dismal.
Yeah.
But it's... Before the war with Iran in June, I was guiding a lot of what I'll call terror tourism. You go down to the site of the Nova Party, and it's horrible.
Wow. Really?
It sucks. And you see, like, the burned out cars that have all been stacked up in a certain spot. And you go and see the bomb shelters where Hirsch Goldberg was, like, lost his hand and, like, throwing grenades back out at the Hamas terrorists. And,
wow.
And you go visit these places. It sucks. It's horrible. You know what I mean? I want to celebrate my Judaism. I don't want to mourn it.
Yeah.
And so I want to celebrate Israel. I don't want to kind of focus on all the horror. But you balance it out. You know what I mean? I'm going to have to go back and guide birthright trips because that's the work that's available.
Yeah.
It's meaningful. It doesn't pay very well, but it's meaningful and it's important. And I think there's a lot of Jewish kids in the United States who are asking a lot of questions about how welcome they really thought they were at Columbia and at Harvard and at Cornell and all these other institutions and at the after school clubs that they've all found themselves kicked out of because they happen to also be connected to Israel.
Yeah.
You can't, it's, I think a lot of us want to draw fine lines and say, well, I talk about my enemies. My enemies are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and the Iranian mullahs. The Palestinian people themselves are somewhere in between. I think Palestinianism, this idea of peoplehood that's sole purpose is to destroy Israel, that makes them my enemies. But if these are people and there are voices like Ahmed Fouad al Khitab and Hossein Abu Bakr al Mansour from Egypt, like who are very rational, pragmatic, practical people who are saying, listen, this whole experiment of like destroy Israel has been a failure and a catastrophe for us. Like those are voices who have no strength and no muscle behind them. But those are the voices that I would love to feel confident in like negotiating peace with.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a little example before we cut out of time and we have to say goodbye and I have to go get my little girl for her after school program. But when Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, came to Israel, he had the idea of peace with Egypt like had a 10% approval in the Israeli population. No one thought seriously about peace with Egypt, especially after 3 wars. And he came to Israel and took a chance. And they took his life for it. But he said peace, and he spoke in our parliament, and he came and took a chance on Menachem Begin. And it switched in a matter of minutes, where all of a sudden everyone in Israel was like, I'll make peace with that guy, because he's willing to put himself out there. The second the Palestinians are willing to actually swallow the bitter pill of trying to cease destroying Israel and say, all right, fine, we want to sue for peace and we want to sue for a state, Israel is going to be all over it. We were at a huge peace movement in the 90s. We had a huge peace movement up until not so long ago. That the majority of us still, if we could feel the confidence of knowing that there could be security, first and foremost, there would be a huge peace movement. But that ultimately rests on the Palestinians. And if they're willing to actually say that out loud in both Hebrew and Arabic, because we're listening in both languages, you'll find a huge receptive audience in Israel. Maybe less than before, and maybe a little bit more cynical and a little bit more hardened, but there are still enough of us who ultimately don't want to keep up this posture of flex forever, because it's exhausting. We're tired. We can fight wars very well, but like we would also love to be able to not have to.
Yeah.
If my enemies will convince us that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
From my lips to God's ears. I hope she's listening.
Nice one. I like you snuck that in there.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for the chance to speak and share my ideas with you.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's been good. I was gonna be like, oh, it won't be all political, but it was totally all political. Yeah.
Well, this is this is the Friday night fight at Madison Square Garden. This is what people are focused on, and this is what we need to talk about. And like, it's interesting because spending time in the United States and hearing people talk about football and Taylor Swift, and I was like, I don't have the luxury to talk about those things.
Yeah.
Like my all stars and superheroes are like our ugly politicians and the philosophers and the professors and the journalists who are engaged, because this for us is life and death.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow amidst the life and death of like our conundrum, there's still a lot of beautiful, powerful, meaningful, creative, artistic, cultural institutions in Israel that are awesome. And I want those same institutions to be thriving amongst my cousins. But they also have to acknowledge that militarily they're not going to ever defeat us, and so live with us and develop the Dubka and the culinary and the cultural and the artistic. Palestinians, ironically, are doing great abroad, outside of Israel and outside of the refugee camps in Lebanon. But like, there's another $1 million question: why are they still in refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon?
Yeah.
And the Arabs need to take a hard look in the mirror. The Jews and the Israelis need to take a hard look in the mirror, and so do the Palestinian people. And then we can also kind of look at how ugly we all are in order to also acknowledge that we're all beautiful too. Inshallah.
Yeah.
God bless, Aaron.
Yeah. Thanks, Amir. Have
nice
a good
to see
one.
you again.
And that was my interview with Amir. I hope you enjoyed it. Welcome to the postmortem. This is where I pick apart the interview and sort of say my thoughts and correct any facts that need correcting. When it comes to this, I don't really want to correct any facts because it's just such a minefield. Trying to correct facts when it comes to Israel and Palestine is a minefield. I would say that the one of the things that I would say is that he gave the death toll in Gaza at about 70,000 based on Hamas's numbers. Those numbers are low. They really stopped counting at about a year into the war. So it's probably more like double that number. But again, there is no way of knowing. So it's important to just say nobody knows how many people have died in Gaza, and probably never will know how many people have died in Gaza. When I interviewed Taya, who's the one who works in Gaza, she talked about how the frustrating thing about Israel being a Jewish state is that you cannot criticize the state without also criticizing Jews because they are so intertwined. And she thinks that that's one of the reasons why it's important to not have ethnostates, because then you can criticize the state without criticizing the ethnicity. I found it interesting, Amir's take on that, where he said that really people need to be criticizing the policy of Israel and not Zionism itself. And as soon as someone starts to criticize Zionism itself, Israelis stop listening. And I have another Jewish Zionist friend who says the same thing. Zionism is a complicated subject, which for most Jews is a non-negotiable. And anytime you start to say Zionism is bad, you lose the sympathy of the majority of Jews. So, I don't know which is the right. That's the whole point of this, right? I don't know who's right. I don't know which argument is the right argument. They make sense from their different perspectives. So I cannot tell you how you're supposed to think about any of this. It's okay. So the reason I did my master's in Israel was I was studying the Israel-Palestine conflict in Canada. I went to U of T, and I found at U of T there was no effort to be balanced whatsoever when they were teaching the Israel-Palestine conflict. The professors had no balance at all. They were blatantly anti-Zionist and blatantly, unapologetically anti-Israel. So I had already found myself being more sympathetic to the Palestinians. So I knew that if I was really going to understand this conflict, I needed to understand the Israeli perspective. And I was not getting that from the professors in the program that I was in. And that is why I decided to go to Israel for a year for my master's, so that I could try and understand, how does this make sense from an Israeli perspective? And I did really gain that understanding. I don't necessarily agree with the way that Israel reacts, but I can understand it now. And Amir touched on two of those things in this interview. One was, I don't think anyone can really appreciate what it means to be a Jew in a Jewish country. I don't think anyone really understands that. Any Christian or Muslim can understand that, because it is easy for us to find a place where, as a Christian and as a Muslim, we feel at home. In Canada, yes, it's a secular country, but it's also a Christian country. We go by the Christian calendar. We go by the Christian holidays. We go by Christian ideals. And so when you're Jewish in a Christian country, as much as they're not being persecuted here, they still always feel like outsiders. They still always have to go to school on their religious holidays and take exams on their religious holidays. They still have to try to set themselves apart from a society that they aren't 100% a part of. So I can really see, if you're a Jew that lived most of your life in America or in Canada, and then you go to Israel, where suddenly everyone is Jewish and everyone sees the world the same way as you, and you don't have that gap, that translation, that cultural gap between you and the people around you that constantly makes you feel like an outsider. So I really can understand why Israelis really need an Israeli state, why they really believe that Zionism is a non-negotiable. I can understand that. I'm an atheist in a Christian country, but I'm culturally Christian. So I do slightly understand what it's like to be an outsider and to feel like you can't talk about your worldview and to feel like you can't talk about your belief system. So I do kind of understand that, but I can't really understand what it's like to be Jewish. I just can't. It's not my experience, but I can have a bit of empathy and compassion for it. The other thing that I really learned from my time in Israel, which again he touched on here, was just how much in the West, we're very individualistic and we have a very short memory. We really look at World War II as ancient history. And when I went to Israel and I talked to my Israeli friends, and my argument was sort of like, after the Holocaust, everyone learned their lesson and they weren't going to do that again to Jews. And if it weren't for the creation of the state of Israel and the things that Israel has done to their Arab neighbors in order to protect the state of Israel, then there would not be anti-Semitism in the world right now. And I really grew to understand that that's a very naive way of looking at things. I think that the way that Israelis look at things is the long history. It always comes back at them. There are times when people tolerate Jews when things are good, and as soon as things start to get worse, they look for someone to blame and they look for someone to attack, and Jews are the easy ones to attack because there's not a lot of them and they are outsiders. So the Jewish way of seeing the world is very much, it doesn't matter how good things are right now, they will get worse again and they will come for us again, and we need to make sure that we can protect ourselves. And when you see the world that way, when you see the world through the lens of almost every single Jewish religious holiday is the commemoration of a persecution, and there's very much a sense of this is a community that has survived 2,000 years of persecutions, and we are responsible for maintaining it. We cannot be the ones who let Jews all die out. We cannot be the ones who end the legacy of surviving through massacres. And when you look at it that way, it really changes the conflict from the way that I look at it, which is just what is happening right now. What is happening right now is Israel is killing loads of people in the name of Jews. And to me, that looks horrible. I would not, I like to think that if I was Jewish, I would put my foot down and I would say, I do not want anyone to die in order to save me. I do not want anyone to die in my name. I don't think that anybody else's life is worth more or less than my life. But I come from a really privileged place where I am allowed to see myself just as an individual rather than as someone who is defending or protecting a legacy that has been passed down for thousands of years. So it really is the lesson I gained from living in Israel was this perspective, this way of seeing the world that is just completely different than I see the world as an atheist in a Christian country with individualist ideals and a short memory. It's very easy for me to judge Israel's actions in Gaza because it's not my life that's in danger. It's not my family's lives that are in danger. It is not my people who are at risk, and I can't possibly comprehend that. So I don't know how I would behave if I were facing the kind of existential risk, existential threat that Israel has. To me, I think, if one person dies on this side and 100 people die on that side, that's not fair. But if I was the one person over here, maybe I would feel differently. I don't know. I've never been in that position, so I don't really feel like I can judge. I like to think I would behave differently, but I don't know. One little correction or one little comment. He mentioned how my friend who goes to Gaza and works in Gaza has to collaborate with Hamas. That is true, but don't forget Hamas is the government. You can't be an aid worker in a country and not collaborate with the government. It's just not possible. Israel also has to collaborate with Hamas whenever they're sending aid in, whenever they're negotiating boundaries and that sort of thing. It's just not, it's the government. Hamas has been labeled a terrorist organization, but it's also the government. He said nobody cared how many civilians were killed by US and Canada in Afghanistan and Iraq. People did care. They did care. Nobody in a position of power cared. But people did care. People were still angry and actively speaking out against it. So I wouldn't say that that's true. Not as many people cared. And there weren't the kinds of, I don't know, there were protests. So I don't think that's really an accurate statement. Another thing he said that I thought was quite interesting, when I asked him about how interesting it is that Israel has made allies with people who, under other circumstances, would probably are considered anti-Semitic, but in their anti-Semitism, they want to protect Israel for anti-Semitic reasons, and Israel has had to make allies with people who don't really like them. But then he also said that their worldviews aren't that different, and he really kind of, there's this idea out there that there's a Judeo-Christian values. That's a saying we hear thrown around a lot, Judeo-Christian values. And he gave some specifics about it. Like a person like Charlie Kirk agrees with Jewish values because they have big families and they prioritize family and they want to spend time with their families and they want to go to church and be active in their religion. And that's why and that's why Christians sort of ally with Jews. The thing is, all of those things are true with Muslims. Muslims have big families. Muslims are very family oriented. Muslims do prioritize church. So when my PhD was on medieval Islam, and I would say that the whole idea of Jews and Christians have more in common with each other than they have in common with Muslims. That's not true. The Abrahamic religions are all extremely similar and have a very similar worldview. And actually, in America, prior to 9/11, Muslims in America almost exclusively voted Republican. It was only when the Republicans turned on Muslims that Muslims suddenly became aligned with the left wing, even though actually the left wing and the Muslims have nothing in common politically, except for the fact that they don't want Muslims to be persecuted. So it's complicated. Everything's complicated. It's all so complicated. Anyways, that was a really great interview. I really enjoyed that. It's kind of spurred me on to contact another couple of my friends from my time in Israel to see if I can get a few more perspectives on this conflict, because it's a big, complicated subject. And to just talk to two people and say, there you go, I've done my due diligence. But this is not going to become a podcast that's all about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I have a lot of interesting friends, and I feel like they have a lot of interesting things to say, and I'm going to keep at it until I either run out of friends or I run out of listeners. That's it for me. Thanks very much, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Take care.